Elixir, A History of Water and Humankind, by Brian Fagan. Narrated by James Langton. Copyright 2011 by Brian Fagan. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Bloomsbury, USA, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto.
"Now, John," quoth Nicholas, "I will not lie. I have found in mine astrology, as I have looked in the moon bright, that now a Monday next at quarter night shall fall a rain, and that so wild and wood, that half so great, was never Noah's flood. This world, he said, in less than an hour shall all be drowned, so hideous is the shower. Thus shall mankind drench and lose her life." Geoffrey Chaucer, The Miller's Tale, circa 1390 CE. The tending of the rice plants, from the time of replanting to the harvest, the sensuality of wading in the warm mud, the concentration of nurturing the fragile plants as one would a child, the sense of continuity one gets from finding under one's fingers, during the weeding of the new crop, the half-decayed vestiges of the last crop, buried in the terrace to fertilize the soil, all these experiences are experiences of the senses and of the body. Arlette Ottino. Preface. Many years ago, 3 San hunters and I trekked across southern Africa's arid Kalahari Desert on a searingly hot morning at the end of the dry season. We had stalked duiker since dawn, searching unsuccessfully for the elusive antelope in the shady thickets where they settled as the sun climbed in the sky. My companions moved effortlessly, apparently without fatigue or thirst, as I paused to take regular swigs from my water bottle. We came to a dry watercourse and a solitary grove of trees that cast the only shade for miles around in the seemingly waterless landscape. The men paused to rest. One of them examined the dry stream bed and dug into the sand with his wooden digging stick. At first the soil was dry, then it was damp. Then, miraculously, water appeared. The hunter crouched, swept the precious liquid up with his hands, and drank deeply. His companions followed, so did I, allowing the water to flow over my sweating face and hands. I have never felt such a close, sensuous connection with the most vital elixir of life. My companions had found water where I had thought there was none. As I got to know them better, I learned something of a new way of looking at the landscape, as an edible and drinkable persona rich in liquid-bearing plants and hidden water. I realized that San existence depended on the distribution of water across the landscape and on the ancient traditions that passed water knowledge from one generation to the next. Since that defining moment, water has always had a profound significance to me. I closed my eyes, listened, and was calmed. The gentle riffle of fountains, of softly flowing water, permeated my senses on that hot afternoon in Granada's Alhambra Palace. I'd walked through the hilltop park, famous for its nightingales, never far from the cooling sounds of running water. A few minutes later, I stood in the court of the pond, where a great rectangular pool lined by myrtles cools the palace. Goldfish swim in the calm waters. When the crowds are gone, the courtyard exudes a profound serenity. Looking out over the city and the sunburnt hills in the distance, I marveled at the lush oasis around me. Later, I learned that the Islamic architects had built a 5-mile, 8-kilometer conduit to bring water from the Darro River. The marvels continued at Jannat al-Arif, the General Life Palace, across a nearby ravine. Nasrid Sultan Muhammad III built his summer palace during the first decade of the 14th century. He spared no expense on the magnificent landscaping, one of the oldest surviving Islamic gardens in the world. In the water garden courtyard, arcing jets of water play on your senses as they soar, sparkle, and tumble into a long rectangular pond. This is a place of colonnades and pavilions for leisure and contemplation. Flower beds press on the shimmering pool. The gentle sounds of flowing water add to the impression of paradise. And a human paradise it is, in a harsh land of steep terrain and unpredictable rainfall. The 4 rivers of the Islamic paradise are rivers of water incorruptible, gardens beneath whose trees rivers flow. The Prophet greets the faithful near a pool in paradise named Kauthar. Granada's resplendent gardens are a green oasis, an ideal of serenity and well-being. They epitomize the close relationship between humans and water, common to all societies on earth, yet expressed in all manner of ways, some of them startlingly direct and intimate. Water. It caresses and comforts us, provides sustenance and refreshment, is something that humanity has cherished since the beginning of history, and means something different to everyone. Water gives us pleasure, as it does at the Alhambra, and has profound sacred qualities. It figures largely in many holy and special places, the soft murmuring of a sacred spring at Delphi in Greece, the reflecting pools of India's Taj Mahal, the reservoirs that surround Angkor Wat in Cambodia, symbolizing the primordial waters of the universe, the font for holy water in Christian cathedrals. Water evokes serenity, harmony, and peaceful existence, the very essence of life, and is commemorated by grand shrines and elaborate rituals in honor of the deities that ensure the continuity of water and life itself. Water. We turn a faucet, and it is there for drinking, something we take completely for granted. So commonplace is water in our daily lives that we are indifferent to it, and have been for a long time. Years ago, Rachel Carson wrote that, in an age when man has forgotten his origins and is blind even to his most essential needs for survival, water, along with other resources, has become the victim of his indifference. Of all the resources that we rely on for survival in today's world, water is the least appreciated and certainly the most misunderstood. For generations, we in the industrial West have just assumed that fresh drinking water is ours to enjoy and to use with dazzling promiscuity in any way we wish. This shouldn't surprise us in an urban age when almost everyone buys their food as packaged commodities from supermarkets, in an era when many city children never see a cow except in pastures. Water is like beef, milk, and pasta, an integral part of our lives that we never think about. A great mistake. History tells us that a defining moment in our use of the Earth's water came with the development of steam power and turbine pumps, and the harnessing of fossil fuels during the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and 19th centuries. For the first time, rapidly expanding and industrializing nations had access to enormous water supplies deep underground, not only for domestic use, but also, and more important, for agriculture and industry. Much of this water mining took hold in arid and semi-arid lands, where lakes, rivers, and springs could never support intensive agriculture or large cities. An orgy of consumption ensued, and continues to this day, amid alarming signs in areas like the American West that the supply of underground water is finite and not being replaced at anything like a sustainable rate. In a warming world, where we know that higher temperatures historically tend to be associated with prolonged droughts, the alarm flags of pending water shortages flap in the environmental wind. Yet most of us, living in drier environments, still take water for granted and are in a state of denial about the impending crisis. California is a case in point. It is suffering from multi-year droughts and greatly diminished water supplies, yet its farmers demand full allocations of irrigation water at heavily subsidized prices. Even in good rainfall years, water for all our needs is in short supply. There are calls for desalination plants to supplement nature's supplies in arid environments, as well as for additional dams and more long-distance aqueducts. All of this misses the point. The distribution of the world's water does not match the areas of greatest need, many of which lie in arid and semi-arid lands.
A huge academic and popular literature surrounds water and the impending crisis, complete with both general and more specific recommendations. There's been much wringing of hands, but it is only now that water conservation is moving to center stage. It is becoming clear that all of us, whether farmers, governments, manufacturers, or common folk, need to do with less in the future at a far more profound level than sweeping instead of washing down our driveways and watering our lawns less frequently. And it may be here that we can learn from our forebears, for they lived in worlds where water was often scarce, frequently hard to obtain, and treated with great respect. They lived long before the days of pumps and artesian wells, but they knew everything there was to know about making do with finite water supplies, and about the force that propels water, gravity. The water managers of the past, whether village farmers, well-connected officials, or court engineers, knew that water is a vital and pitiless force in human life. We can consume, but can never completely tame it. As long ago as the 6th century BCE, the Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu wrote in his Tao Te Ching, "Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. The soft overcomes the hard, the gentle overcomes the rigid." History teaches us again and again how right he was. This is a book about human relationships with water in the past, as far as I can tell the first such work to tackle the subject on a global scale. The idea for such a project revolved in my mind for decades. A seed germinated unconsciously many years ago when I was living among subsistence farmers in Central Africa, a few miles downstream of a major hydroelectric dam. More seeds of the idea took root in later years. While working in Africa, I experienced water deprivation at first hand on many occasions. Walking long miles on archaeological surveys with only a water bottle on my hip when the temperature was in the 80s taught me hard lessons about dehydration. I grew my beard, now 44 years old, after several water-short weeks during fieldwork in Uganda, when washing was a real luxury. Years later, crossing the Atlantic in a sailboat was a memorable experience, especially when one of our spare water cans sprang a leak in mid-ocean, a nerve-wracking incident by any standards. More recently, I've done a great deal of bicycling on hot California days. Such trips have reminded me forcibly about the need to keep hydrated. The idea finally took root when my wife, a master gardener, re-landscaped our yard with drought-resistant plants and pulled out all our lawns. Literally the day she completed the project, I heard a radio story about plans for a water park along the drought-challenged coastline south of Los Angeles, and another one about a wealthy resident of our city who spent $30,000 on tanked-in water for his huge lawns. These tales of wasteful consumption tipped the scale. For some years, I had been writing a series of books on ancient climate change, especially on the medieval warm period, and on El Niños, which brought me up against the issue of prolonged droughts time and time again. With my hard-won experiences with water, lengthy exposure to the vicissitudes of ancient climate change, and long decades of teaching archaeology on a global scale, it was time to tackle what was to me a virtually unknown subject. The resulting journey has given me a unique perspective on ancient societies of all kinds, and the ways in which they tried to achieve the holy grail of any water manager, whether an African villager or a Chinese irrigation engineer: long-term sustainability. As I researched Elixir, I was struck by how little most people's relationship with water changed over the thousands of years, from the first appearance of agriculture some 12,000 years ago into medieval times and beyond. Even today, millions of subsistence farmers live from harvest to harvest, from one rainy season to the next, dependent on unpredictable water supplies from the heavens. This led me to think of the history of humans and water in terms of 3 stages, which overlap with one another. The first goes back to the remote past and endures in places today.
Water was an unreliable, often scarce, and always valuable resource, so precious that it was sacred in almost every human society. The second stage began in part about 2,000 years ago, accelerated during the European Middle Ages, and reached fruition during the Industrial Revolution, when water became a mere commodity. Eventually, we developed the technology to pump water from deep beneath the earth and to harvest it on a large scale. Water became something we could exploit without ever worrying about how much we used. Now, during the early 21st century, we are in a third stage where we are finally realizing that water is a finite resource, something to be conserved and treated with a respect, even reverence, that we haven't displayed in a long time. With these broad stages in mind, Elixir revolves around three broad themes. The first is gravity, the fact that water flows downslope from a higher point to a lower one. There was no other way of moving water except for small volume pumps and water wheels until the Industrial Revolution. Even today, gravity plays a central role in water management everywhere, even with long-distance aqueducts, such as those that feed vast cities like Los Angeles and Phoenix. Ancient Roman and Greek engineers were maestros of gravity-fed water delivery. So were the Chinese and the Inca of Peru. Dozens of smaller-scale societies and village farmers around the world still use gravity to irrigate their fields and to water their beasts. Some of them have maintained sustainable water supplies for centuries and are capable of doing so indefinitely if other users don't hijack their sources with pumps and earth-moving machinery. This book is a history of the triumph of gravity, the silent, ubiquitous force behind nearly all human relationships with water. Gravity lies behind the flexible, inexorable forces of water, but those who take advantage of it don't pretend to control them. The second theme is the close relationship between ritual and water management of all kinds. Water has a special place in all human societies. It's the essence of fertility and growth, of sustained life, associated with cleansing and renewal, with the spiritual forces of the cosmos. We've worshipped it and celebrated its magical flowing qualities, commemorated its mystical dimensions. We're in awe of water. As fisherfolk, sailors, and surfers, we respect its mysterious attractions. At the same time, it has an indispensable role in human life, for it lies behind everything we do, from cooking food and washing clothes to agriculture, cattle herding, even baseball, tennis, and golf. Water is one of the few cultural universals, inspiring a profound mingling of ritual and day-to-day use. Ritual and religious beliefs surrounding water permeate every stage of human life, from birth to death. Christian infants are baptized in holy water. The ancient Egyptians and the Maya believed that their worlds began in the still waters of the primordium. Bronze Age farmers on the shores of the North Sea 3,000 years ago thought that their ancestors dwelled beneath the heaving waters of the ocean, the realm of the dead. Australian Aboriginal existence and much of its ritual revolves around knowledge of where water lies across the landscape. This book goes beyond hydrology and human ingenuity to explore some of the spiritual ties between ancient human societies and water. The third theme is technology versus sustainability, efforts at living within one's hydrological means. The past teaches us much about water management and has significant lessons for today and the future. Early theories about ancient irrigation conjured up dramatic images of slaves laboring waist-deep in mud at the bidding of a harsh supervisor's whip. Such scenarios featured anonymous regiments of laborers who transformed landscapes and created the underpinnings of pre-industrial civilizations like those of Mesopotamia and China. Famed movie producer Cecil B. DeMille might have dreamed of these lingering stereotypes, which are inaccurate at best, but occasionally still haunt the history books. In fact, some of the past's most effective irrigation works involved small villages and came online long before any great ruler ascended his throne. Simple furrow irrigation, the diversion of stream and river water into nearby fields, is almost as old as farming itself, a logical step for villagers grappling with irregular rainfall, potential crop failures, and long dry seasons. Like their remote hunting and gathering ancestors, they were experts at managing risk, at sustaining life by turning to wild plants or hunting, by developing simple ways of bringing water in gently sloping furrows to their fields. Such self-sustaining water management survived far from the historical limelight in subsistence farming communities throughout the world for thousands of years. It still flourishes today in many places where the diesel engine and the turbine pump are but expensive dreams. This type of agriculture probably reaches its most sophisticated iteration among the rice farmers of Bali in Southeast Asia. Here, the allocation and management of water is in the hands of the farmers themselves and the deities, for ritual and irrigation are completely intertwined. Contrary to popular belief, village irrigation and local control of water remained very important long after the appearance of urban civilization in China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. As I argue, the main interest of rulers and their officials was not in irrigation and water management as such, but in the food surpluses that they produced, which supported the state. Taxes collected in grain or labor were the mainstay of pre-industrial civilizations everywhere, where the many toiled for the benefit of the few. The Egyptian pharaohs presided over an agrarian kingdom where everyone had strong ties to ancestral villages and to the land. Each summer, an inundation flooded basins in the floodplain in a routine that went back centuries before the first divine king ruled Upper and Lower Egypt. The grain and labor of the villagers built the pyramids and great temples, and when there was a drought in about 2200 BCE, Egypt fell apart for more than 100 years. In response, later pharaohs embarked on much larger-scale irrigation works in places like the Fayum Depression to the west of the Nile, and invested heavily in granaries. The same was true in Mesopotamia, where the early cities were little more than agglomerations of villages that came together in the face of increasingly scarce floodwaters. Circumstances changed as climate changes in the Indian Ocean caused major shifts in monsoon patterns after 2800 BCE. Summer no longer brought welcome rain to Mesopotamian farmers. Every village now relied more heavily on spring floods for irrigation water. More centralized control of irrigation works and water became imperative to ensure equitable distribution of water, especially in increasingly frequent drought years. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, an army of officials now supervised canal maintenance and harvests, for careful water management made an immediate difference between famine and plenty for increasingly dense rural and urban populations. Inevitably, the scale of irrigation works grew and grew with the Assyrians and their small armies of prisoners of war, and with the Sasanians after them, who, like some Chinese emperors, transformed entire landscapes, sometimes with devastating ecological consequences. Southern Mesopotamian farmers had confronted increasing salinization from the early days of irrigation, handling it with, among other methods, systematic fallowing. But Mesopotamia later became a salt-ridden wilderness after the Sasanians took up 5 times more land under more irrigation than ever before in an insatiable quest for tax revenue and wealth. The result was promiscuous water usage and the ecological devastation of thousands of acres. The analogies with today's unthinking water usage in the American West are sobering. Some of China's large-scale irrigation works along the Huang River have contributed to the ecological crisis of endemic silting and water shortages that inflict the region today. Viewed in retrospect, such failed projects offer a sobering example of what happens to cities, farmers, landscapes, and indeed entire societies when sustainability evaporates. There were notable triumphs of technology and sustainability too, like in ancient Greek cities that made use of water-rich karst formations to provide reliable, perennial water supplies for domestic use, agriculture, and waste disposal. The Romans, with their aqueducts, took a long-established technology and turned it into an architectural art form, as much as a matter of prestige and for public bathing as for reliable water supplies. Many of their water systems were sustainable over many centuries, even if they were wasteful. Roman expertise with water wheels and mills formed an important legacy for medieval Europe. The Romans did not invent such devices, but they used them with near-industrial effect, grinding grain for Rome and communities like Arles. Anyone relying on gravity-derived water supplies had no option but to maintain a high degree of self-sustainability, especially in arid lands. The groundwater tapping Kanats of Iran and the Puquios of the southern Andes, gravity-fed, humanly dug tunnels that tapped groundwater, were brilliant, simple inventions that determined where cities, towns, and villages were to lie. With such small-scale devices, you brought the settlement to the water. The Assyrians, Greeks, and Romans took another tack, sometimes using aqueducts for the reverse purpose. The peasants and engineers of medieval Islam were perhaps the most ingenious of all pre-industrial water managers. They used the simplest of technologies to wrest water from seemingly arid landscapes. As has become apparent in recent years, almost all water management in the Islamic world was ultimately based in the village, in the small farming community that designed its own water system based on the local contours, using dams and canals, large and small. When it came to cities, mosques, and palaces, the same simple gravity-based technologies, combined with water wheels and the labor of human and beast, came into play. By the 16th century, the European and Mediterranean worlds had reached the limits of gravity-driven water systems. 2 centuries later, the Industrial Revolution changed the entire water equation for humanity with pumps and earth-moving machinery that opened up hitherto inaccessible water supplies in the depths of the earth. In China, an 18th-century Qing dynasty official named Chen Hongmao paid thousands of laborers to drain entire landscapes and dig canals that brought mountain water to lowland fields. Unbeknownst to him, Chinese water management was close to a point that it reached some time later, when nothing further could be done to manage water with the existing technology. Only a century after Chen's hard work, a new technological era had dawned on the other side of the world, which allowed governments to reshape entire landscapes and transport water over distances and mountain ranges as never before, with only a fraction of the unskilled human labor used by Chen. There's another major facet of humans' relationship with water that I don't explore in these pages: the use of water for both transport and voyaging, be it over a lake, up a river, or across an ocean. Until the domestication of the camel in the first millennium BCE, waterways, especially major rivers like the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Nile, and the Yangtze, provided much better ways of traveling than on foot or on the back of an ass or horse that required regular watering. Great rivers became highways from one village or city to another, and for moving goods of all kinds over distances, long and short. These journeys spawned breakthrough inventions like the planked boat and the sail. By 3000 BCE, sailing vessels were carrying timber and other heavy cargoes long distances with the aid of prevailing winds and river currents. From these inland ventures, it was a small step to coasting along Mediterranean and Persian Gulf shores, and from there to undertaking voyages to lands, known and unknown, invisible over the far horizon. In fact, seafaring in a systematic way began much earlier than civilization, at least 45,000 years ago, off the coast of Southeast Asia. It took many millennia for human societies of all kinds to decipher the oceans. How exactly they did so remains one of the fascinating conundrums of history. What caused people to cross open water to uninhabited land dimly visible offshore on clear days? Was it food shortages, or a lack of agricultural land? Or was it simply human curiosity? How and why did people in the southwestern Pacific decide to sail in outrigger canoes in search of islands deep in the unknown Pacific 3,000 years ago?
What were the beliefs and spiritual relationships that sustained human societies as they colonized the Aleutian Islands or the Aegean Sea in the Mediterranean?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?